Let's talk about composition. So there's two different types of composition. There's camera-based composition, and then there's lighting-based composition. And a lot of studios, or some studios, will realize the difference. At Pixar, we have two different directors of photography. There's a director of photography over camera placement, and then there's the director of photography over lighting. Both are really key in the composition of an image, but they both have different roles. So let's kind of talk through some of these. Camera-based composition is physically where you place the camera, where you place the props in the set, how you position everything to kind of tell a story with the physical positioning of everything. So it doesn't have to do with lighting, it's just all about where you place the camera. So let's look at some examples. You have an establishing shot, which is usually kind of a wide shot that shows your whole location. So I'm going to focus here on this point with my son, kind of way in the middle, little tiny right there. This is an extreme wide angle. This is a wide angle lens. You can kind of see everything in the scene. I could do this at a different angle. Instead of being flat on, I could do this kind of at a 3/4 angle, which makes it a little bit more interesting, with some perspective and some foreground objects. Still same kind of wide angle lens, a little bit closer. I could use a zoom lens, a long lens as we call it. 200 millimeter lens is what was used here. Gives a completely different feel, for an establishing shot, but still you're kind of wide. You can see the whole character. Different choices, kind of different storytelling methods. Then consider it a medium shot, kind of get up close to a character. You can see their shoulders, you can see their head. This is with a wide lens. We could do a close-up shot where you're kind of really zoomed into their face. You could do an extreme close-up shot or a super extreme close-up shot. But all of these have kind of different meanings of the way you're telling your story. You can do up shots where you're kind of down on the ground looking up. This is good for times when you want the character to feel kind of important or powerful. There's a lot of film school stuff that you could kind of interject here, thoughts on the way camera angles work, but a down shot if you want them to feel kind of like lonely. There's so much you can do with this based on your camera angle to help tell your story, but you should really spend some time thinking about this to say, okay, what kind of shots do I want? Where should I place the camera? It's not always just kind of standard, here's your scene, place a camera and not think about it. Really, how are you going to tell the story? So there's different types of shots, and then there's different types of lenses. And you would choose your lens based on the mood and what you need for the shot. So this is again a wide angle lens, a 35 millimeter lens, and I'm standing really far away. Compared to doing a long lens from that same position, what this will do is you have a long zoom lens from far away. It will tend to make the background feel really huge. In comparison to my son here, you really see the height of these windows. If you're far away and you've got a city in the background, a long lens will tend to make that city feel bigger, more imposing. But it will also remove some of your perspective. So compared to wide angle zoom, wide angle you'll get a real sense of depth, but that building won't feel quite so. Not quite as big as this does. So here's an upshot using a super wide angle lens. This is a 15 millimeter. Technically this is a 10 millimeter lens, but on this camera with a 1.5 crop, it's a 15 millimeter. But notice the difference between a 15 millimeter and a 35. And the different feel it gets. If you have a super fisheye, you get tons of perspective, and you can really see, this kind of angle of perspective. You get this kind of warping. Where this feels a little bit more natural to your eye, you still get some perspective, but you're losing some of the background because it's not quite as wide. Again, this is a medium shot, so you can kind of see, half of the character with a fisheye lens. The problem with this is it starts to warp the character, but it can be useful in certain scenes. It's kind of a, it could be a certain look that you really want, super wide angle lens. compared to, medium shot. This is a same kind of framing on the character, but with a 35, now you see less of the background. You still get some perspective. Compared to using a really long lens, now the background it kind of like, it makes it feel farther away but bigger. You're getting a lot less of what you're seeing in the background, and you can kind of focus in on the character. So here's a super close-up shot using the wide-angle lens. So this is very close to my son's face here. I'm probably just a few inches away with this wide-angle lens. Versus a long lens where I'm like, 6 or 8 feet away with a zoom lens onto his face. You notice the difference. The general framing is kind of the same of how much his face you see, but this will feel a little bit more natural. One of the uses for changing out your lenses, doing different looks, is in the storytelling. You'll notice in a lot of stories, it'll start with an establishing shot, kind of a wide shot where you see the whole set. So that way, as you're watching a movie, you can see the world that the characters are in. And then it will cut to closer shots, medium shots, where you kind of, have the characters talking to each other. And if it becomes, the closer you get to, and this is somewhat theory, but I find this to be true, that the closer the camera gets to the character's face, and the shallower the depth of field, so that, the more blurry the background gets, the more you kind of feel like you're inside the character's thoughts, that the background, the environment they're in doesn't matter, and so you can have a conversation between these two characters that's very personal and up front and very close. So this is an area to study. This is not something you learn in a day. A lot of people go to film school to really learn what is the best way to tell a story with your camera choices. How close do you get? What type of lens do you use? One other thing we can look at here is depth of field. So this is with you'll see this kind of f-stop number. This is a pretty fast lens, a 2.5, which means there's a very shallow depth of field. The aperture of this lens is opened all the way wide, so lots of light is coming through, but what that does is it causes all the background to kind of go out of focus, one point of focus. And, compared to increasing this number significantly, which makes the hole on the camera that lets light through much smaller, which focuses more of the light. I could keep pushing this up, into the 20s until everything is perfectly crisp and focused, but I would require a lot of light. Again, something for you to study if you're not familiar with this, with traditional photography. Go back and kind of study this world is really fascinating. But your choices of, what level of depth of field do you want, your level of focus, and how you can tell the story. If it's important to see something happening in the background, you might want to have a wider depth of field, deep focus. Or you can have something where all that matters is the character's face, and so you can let the background be obscured. All right, let's talk about a few different things of composition. This is still kind of camera-based composition. So the rule of thirds. So there is way back in ancient Greece, they came up with this thing called the golden ratio. And it's, in theory, this looks a little bit confusing, but to simplify it, it's kind of the rule of thirds. To say if you take an image and you split it up, cut things into 3 pieces this way, 3 pieces this way, our eyes naturally go to these kind of 4 points here, not to the direct center of an image. So I know a lot of amateur photographers like to put, or just regular people like to just put, things in the very center. That's where you focus your image. But there's something appealing about putting it kind of off to the side, putting something into the area of these third regions. This is the, kind of third. This is where your eye will tend to look in this image, not in the direct center. This is the most appealing spot in composition. So here's an image. I've kind of done this. I have a character off to the side you kind of look at, which is kind of a third down, third back over here, and you got this character up here that's sort of in the third region. You kind of look at this little thing in the middle. This is an image of the tooth fairy that I painted, after my son lost his first tooth. Anyway, and this image, even though it's talking about a different thing, also has the rule of thirds. Your eye goes here, and your eye goes here. case. A rule of thirds, it's just kind of pretty. It's just one of those things it's the way, it's a nice way of thinking and framing an image. Okay, another important thing when choosing camera angle, you're working with a two-dimensional space. So when somebody is looking at your illustration, your painting, or your movie that you're making, they're looking at a two-dimensional image, but you want to give a sense of three-dimensional space. And so one of the ways to do that is with scale and repetition. So to show scale, one of the ways to do this is to repeat objects. So we have this roof, and you can see these little characters on top of this roof, and then you see roofs similar to it repeated in the background, and you get a sense that this place is really, really huge because you have these repeating objects. I have to state here, a lot of the images that you're going to see, I've used reference from different films. This was from Star Wars, and I kind of painted my own versions off of, looking at, the actual images from film as kind of a reference to kind of give an idea for, these are not original compositions that I've done. This is just a way for me to be able to use images kind of similar in reference films and not have them come back to bite me. So scale and repetition, really, really awesome, important thing. Okay, so physically basing your camera, choosing your camera angles, your camera lenses, the positioning of objects, how to repeat objects in the scene to give a sense of scale. And then after that comes light-based composition. So this is, the camera's locked. The placement of the characters is locked. How are you going to use the light in the scene to make your composition stronger? So tons of things here. It's kind of my passion. I do lighting for a living, so a lot of these things, some of these will be obvious, some of them, I don't know, maybe they'll be new to you, but it's things that we think about as lighting artists all the time. Okay, let's talk about three-point lighting. If you are not familiar with three-point lighting, this is what's used for portrait photography. Just kind of three main lights that they use, and you can frame an image really well with just three sets of lights. So the first light would be the key light. Usually the strongest, brightest light in a scene in a three-point lighting setup like this. Usually this light comes from a kind of 45-degree angle. So notice it's not coming flat from camera. It's not like a flash cube on a camera that makes everything flat. It's coming at an angle. In which what that does is it gives you an area of bright and an area of dark, an area of shadow. So you can kind of see, this light raking across the surface. So bright area, dark area. The next light in this is called a kick light. Kick light usually comes opposite of the key, and it's much softer, softer shadows usually, but kind of opposite angle of the key. And so you got this light coming from the opposite side that kind of fills in a little bit into that shadowed area from the key light. And the third of the three-point lighting setup is a rim light. So these are lights that are a little bit brighter. They're coming from back, and what they do is they kind of separate the character from the background. So they provide this rim of light around the character. So you add all three of those together, and with those three lights, you can really kind of see the shape and the form of the character really well. The idea of three-point lighting is to be able to, again, we're working in two-dimensional space. You want to show as much three-dimensional shape as you can. So having, a bright side, a dark side, but light that kind of changes and wraps around the objects so you can see all of its details. This is kind of very standard. Master three-point lighting, and then you can start breaking the rule of three-point lighting and doing other things. But this is kind of key for making an image look good instead of looking flat, using composition. So with three-point lighting, there's something that we often refer to as a core shadow. So on a sphere, you've got a key light coming from this side, you've got a kick from this side, and this dark area in between is kind of a core shadow. This helps you really see the shape. The shape of this sphere is really easy to read, even though this is a two-dimensional image. Same with on a face. You got a key, you got a kick, and you got this kind of dark area in between. Our eyes respond to contrast. So if you have an image, you don't want to flat light it, where everything's all the same color, it's the same tone. Our eyes pick up on changes in tone, changes in value, the contrast between light and dark. And so it's kind of nice to use lighting to make sure that you have this contrast to draw your eye where it needs to be. Another useful tip with lighting is to frame your images. Some of this is camera based. I decided to put this into light based composition. So in an image, you want to be able to look at something in the scene. Is you're going to use other objects to help frame it. You're going to kind of pull these, I'm using these trees as a framing element to draw your eye to say, look back down, look right here at this cottage. When your eye starts to go up here, these trees kind of go, nope, point you back down. This path kind of points you up. It's kind of a framing element. With that, we have this thing, foreground, middle ground, background. It's quite common in film, again, to give a sense of depth and an illustration. So you have foreground objects, these trees, they're closest to us. And a lot of times foreground objects tend to be darker and they get closer to camera. They help frame things. There's no atmosphere that's affecting those, so they would be the darkest blacks that you would have in a scene. Then you have the middle ground, which is usually the focal point. It's kind of where you look, the middle ground. And then you've got the background way back here, these mountains and these trees. Lots of atmosphere, so it kind of pushes it off into the background and makes the cottage kind of pop off the scene. So foreground, middle ground, background, framing elements, really nice tool for making your composition strong, getting your eye to look where it needs to look. Another example of kind of, framing, I'm using the light in this case. I had this scene and I decided to, paint light coming in through the window, lights the floor. Really the focal point's right here. It's this desk. But I used all this extra clutter and I just made it where just a little bit of light was bouncing off the floor onto the clutter to help frame, these darker elements all kind of point in. Everything's kind of pointing down to say, look right here. But there's lots of little things to kind of draw your eye around, but I'm using these framing elements to make this scene compositionally stronger. Pools of light. Something that I see done way too often, especially among students learning lighting for the first time, is that they just put lots of light in the scene. Okay, let's put sun, and the sun hits everything. But one thing that's quite nice is to have that variation, to have little pools of light. So instead of having sunlight hitting everywhere, make it look like there's shadows in the scene, like this cliff. It could have had sunlight all the way to the top, but it was kind of nice to have a dark spot, like there's a shadow of a cloud up here, and just kind of pool the light into just certain areas, and it's all, in shadow along here. So you've got just a little bit of light. Same with characters. Quick painting from Blade Runner. Instead of having the character fully lit, there's something emotional and powerful. Sometimes you can do this creepy type thing, or sometimes you can do this beautiful, kind of light with just having a pool of light. Variation where it's not all just one tone, but the light, just goes into little spots. Talking about that, gradients of tone. This is something that I've come up with, and I always love to see this. I don't like total flat colors. You could paint this wall a total flat color, but having variation, so you have dark areas, you have bright areas, but you don't ever have something that's totally flat. You always have some sort of gradient of the value, gradients of tones. So it gets brightest here, but then it kind of fades off on the edge. You get this vignette along the edge. You get areas, with ambient occlusion. You're using all your tools of the trade, all the ways that light works, to make sure that your image rarely has just one solid flat color. That this color, this wall, shouldn't just be flat. It should always have kind of some variation to it. And it makes it interesting. Our eyes, again, like differences in tone and differences in color. And so having this kind of, changing of color instead of just being flat. Here's an example of gradients of tone. In this room, I could have just kind of lit it with a lamp in the middle, but I decided what I really like is the subtlety of color. So I'm saying, again, light coming in, hitting the floor. I love bounced light. So this whole scene is kind of lit with bounced light, and I've got subtle variations of the brightness of the wall, and it's this gradient of tone that it gets darker and darker as it gets kind of near the edges. The floor is not one flat color. It slowly gets darker and darker into the corners. I'm always on every object. Nothing is one flat color, one range of tone. Everything kind of falls off with slight variations in color. Same with this. Kind of see the ramping of dark up into the rafters up here compared to the rest of the wall, and always kind of changes in tone and color that make it interesting for our eyes and to help in composition. It makes it feel more natural because that's what light really does. More examples. Instead of having everything flat lit, I have like spots, of light that come in from different angles so that you don't just have blue. You have different variations of blue. Okay, this one I painted really fast. This kind of crappy. I couldn't find a good film example, so I just kind of slapped something together. It looks horrible, but it's going to tell this point really good. So light on dark, dark on light. This was used in film noir quite a bit from film history, dark films, but it's used, it can be used all over the place. But the idea of this is to have dark objects be framed on a light background and then have light objects be framed on a dark background. What that does is it allows, thinking when you're using lighting. So I want this character to be important and I want this character to be important. So I'm using the lighting to kind of push the backgrounds to kind of frame these objects. So, this character, you can really see him because he's dark, but he's on a light background, so he really reads. There's a really great shot in Batman Begins where Batman's up on this rooftop, and it's clever because you look at all the buildings, and all the buildings, the lights are off except the one that's right behind his head, and they turn all the lights on, and it frames him perfectly. So he's a dark character at night in a dark scene, and it would be normally hard to see him, but because they use the background, they put bright white lights on a window behind him, you can read his shape. He kind of silhouettes. So light on dark, dark on light. Again, our eyes are looking for contrast, so this is a really great way to use light for your scenes. Atmosphere. I almost can't state this enough. Probably cliche in a lot of my paintings, but it's amazing the power of atmosphere. If you've ever been to a live action film shoot, you see how much they use, smoke machines, fog machines. Again, we're working with a two-dimensional image and we have to give three-dimensional information. So the use of atmosphere, kind of fog in the distance, is a powerful tool to tell you about depth. These trees are about the same size, but I know this one's farther back because there's more atmosphere. And I can really use this. This is an amazingly powerful compositional tool to kind of draw your eye where it needs to be. Here's some examples from different actual films where if this was flatly lit in this scene, they've got this one character that your eye is supposed to draw to. Because there's smoke in the scene, it's refracting off of the light in the background, and it pushes these characters back into the background and these characters kind of into the foreground, but it'll make a character pop out. So you can say, that's the character. I'm using the use of atmosphere to help frame the character. The dark on light again. Same with this. This was a scene that it's just amazing. Most people would not think that there would be that much smoke. You can imagine it on distant mountains, but this is like within a distance of maybe 20, 30 feet, 10 meters or so, and you've got so much atmosphere in here that you can't even really see the details of these characters. It's a powerful tool that's used quite often in film. Here's another example of painting I did where I was strongly using atmosphere to help draw the shapes. This scene is supposed to be dark down in a cave, and there's relatively little direct light sources. There's this light that's kind of coming down from the top of this hole in this cave, and then there's light from the lava and these little lights here. If I didn't have the atmosphere picking up all that light, it would be really hard to read. Everything would just kind of go black. So I'm using a lot of that element to separate am using these framing elements, again, foreground, middle ground, background, to kind of help frame this image, make a strong composition where your eye can go to different points and still stay within the image. Implied lighting. This is again another powerful tool, and I'll show you more later, practical application of this. But is the idea of you have a scene and you want to imply that there's more to this world than what you're actually seeing. So look at this light over here. I put a light, kind of makes it look like a window, like because of this shadow, it makes you think that there's some sort of grate, there's something off screen, there's some sort of big window, and you can kind of see the window panes here. So I'm implying more to the scene than is really there. This could be used also with putting a shadow of a tree or something off screen. The beginning of Toy Story 2 and Buzz Lightyear's kind of coming into Zurg's fortress. There's a great scene in the room where he goes to what he thinks is the battery power. And there's, again, light from the ceiling that's kind of implying that there's a really tall ceiling and there's something else up there. Very, very powerful tool for making your world bigger than it actually is. Backlighting. This can be used where instead of having 3-point lighting where you always have a key, a kick, and rims, there's times where you'll use your rim as your brightest light. Instead of having a key, you'll do backlighting. It's just a rim to kind of light these characters. The advantage of this is like in this scene, it's really quite beautiful. You can have just a little sliver of light that helps pop them off the background, but then you're using bounce light in the scene to really draw your eye to where it needs to be, and to really kind of give this soft, magical kind of tone to your composition. So something used quite common. I like this a lot when I go to do photography. Instead of having bright sunlight on their faces and harsh shadows, choosing to backlight things and then letting bounce light, give nice soft shadows where you read it and nothing looks harsh, no really hard shadows. Talking about shadows, there's another method that's shadow only lighting. So this is where you're using silhouettes. Again, great with atmosphere, but there's a lot that you can do where you don't need a key light or kick light at all. You're just going to light the set in such a way that the character pops and you can read the shape of the character with just a silhouette. Another kind of interesting method to break the idea of 3-point lighting. You should master 3-point lighting first. But once you've got that down, then you can consider doing things like this, where you've got non-key lighting. So you're using bounce light as your key light. So light that's from this lamp bouncing off the table up onto the character's face. You can give a different mood. You should really think a lot about mood. What is the story you're telling? In this particular examples, makes the character look a little bit mysterious or a little bit scary in some ways. Sometimes it can be used in a soft, kind of beautiful way. Again, the magic of bounce light. Bounce light is so soft, and the shadows are so interesting. It's very complex with the diffused light. You can take a scene. This is from the movie The Mission, where these characters are sitting around a table, and Robert De Niro was a slave trader, and he's been taken in as a missionary. He's redeemed himself and walked away from his slave trading, and he's learning a new way of life. To instead of enslaving the people, he's then giving back to them. And these two missionaries are sitting around and they're kind of talking about the idea of what is love, what is forgiveness. And so the lighting in this scene was just beautiful, where you've got kind of backlit from this one window, a little bit of kind of rim light coming on the characters, but most of it's the light that's bouncing off the table and back up onto their faces. Just a real soft bounce light. So it's non-key lighting. Very beautiful tool. Color palette is powerful. Thinking about what is the general color of your film. Most people don't really think about this, that they don't realize that we spend a lot of time thinking about the color in our sequences in a movie. from a storytelling standpoint, like in The Incredibles, here's some paintings inspired from The Incredibles. At the beginning of the film, the colors are hyper saturated. They're almost too much because it's in Bob's memory of the glory days. Mr. Incredible's, perfect time, and all the colors are just too strong. And then when all the lawsuits happen and we cut to present day, he's in this office where he's just not being used. And so the director of photography and the art director decided that it would be awesome to go from this strong colors and just suck all the color out. So this kind of semi-monochromatic type of scene. So you feel it. You don't really, most audience members wouldn't ever notice. You go, oh, look what they did with the lighting. That was great. It's just something you emotionally feel in choosing your color palette. We do a whole color script for our films as we're working, kind of plan out, what is the emotional mood of this scene? And so what colors should we use? Should it be high contrast? Should it be really soft? Should it be backlit? Should it be, should it be strong shadows or soft shadows? I mean, all of that to help tell the story of that moment. Color palette in The Matrix. So if you've ever noticed only in the first Matrix movie, that every time they're in the Matrix, everything got tinted this kind of green type colors, this sickly color. And then once Neo got into the real world, everything was always tinted slightly cool and blue. So there was always a contrast between this green and this blue. Again, a subtle choice from the cinematographer's standpoint to choose to help differentiate between these two different worlds and what the best use of your storytelling. Exposure is another kind of key thing here to think about. When you're doing computer graphics or you're doing painting, sometimes you can paint everything perfectly exposed. But in the real world, the way a camera works, the lighting outside, the sunlight is so bright compared to light inside of a room. So I can change my settings on my camera to say, well, okay, I want us to be able to see the details of the trees and the cars and everything back there. But then my focal point is going to be kind of dark. So my sun kind of gets silhouetted, which might be, if I'm trying to do a scene of my son coming in as a mystery person, that could work. Or I can choose to be able to see his face clearly, but then the background completely blows out and you lose all those details. Sometimes you want to intentionally change your exposure so that you can help tell a different story. Another useful thing about exposure is when you're dealing with camera settings in some software, when you're doing 3D lighting, 3D rendering, the amount of bounce light that you'll see. If you have the exposure set like this, you'll be able to see so much more subtlety in the bounce lights. Versus, exposing it, so you can see all the bright areas, but now all this dark areas, you're not seeing all that bounce light. So kind of creative choices of, how do you want to expose these images? Continuity. This is making sure that the lighting in a sequence looks consistent. You want it to feel like it was all shot right at that same moment, that this world feels continuous, like the lighting in this scene, it flows between shots. When you're doing live action lighting, this is sometimes difficult because you might be shooting over a period of days or a week or more in a single location. In the end film, it takes place in 10 seconds. It's supposed to look like it all happened instantaneously, like continuously. But one of the traps that I find a lot of students get into is that they think too technically. You start with the scene and say the sunlight is coming in from this one angle and that's the way it has to be. So look at the scene. This is from Lord of the Rings, the very first movie, The Fellowship of the Ring. And the thing that was most important with continuity is not technical accuracy of where the lights were in the scene compared to the next shot. The thing that was most important was that the color and the mood and the tone matches. So you get this kind of cool blues. You get the same cool blues in every shot, so it feels like it's all lit at the same time. It flows between shot to shot. But here's the interesting thing to study in this. So this is the scene where Frodo's being chased by the Dark Riders, and he and his other Hobbit friends are running down and jumping on this ferry boat to get on the river so that the Dark Riders don't catch them. But what I found interesting with this is that if you look at the first shot, Frodo's running, and for mood, they decided to frame him kind of backlit with the moonlight, really bright moonlight. So he's kind of lit from behind, and it looks really strong and moody. Instead of him being lit from the front, you see all the details of his face, kind of lit from behind. But then the camera turns 180 degrees to focus on his friends, and magically, the moon has stuck to the camera and also moved 180 degrees and is now behind those characters. So there is a break in continuity that's acceptable. You don't have to think about this accurately to say, well, if it's coming from behind on him, the moonlight should be coming onto the front of them. This is something that will really take years to understand where you can break these rules. But positioning of lights is amazingly forgiving when it comes to film. You can move things around. It's amazing. People have no idea how much we move things around in shots. From shot to shot, we're completely changing the angle of the key light. But we're doing it in such a way that it helps frame the characters. It helps aid the mood in the storytelling instead of just being technically accurate. You want to think about this as cinema. You want cinematic, imagery. You're telling a story, so make it beautiful as storytelling, and don't think about just technical accuracy. So I want to talk about split-second composition. This is kind of important. The difference between lighting for a poster, or for a game cover or something like that, lighting, making fine art compared to making film. In a film, the average time that a shot will be on screen is, in a shot meaning one camera angle before the camera changes and looks somewhere else, is only like 2.5 seconds, is the average length of time that a camera will stay in that angle. So in this particular angle, we're looking at this character. This is taken from Star Wars. And Luke here is kind of standing in the scene. If I only have 2 seconds to read this entire image, it's vital that I have a focal point to the scene. It's vital that I use the lighting kind of to draw your eye to where it needs to be. Luke is where you should be looking. This scene could have been lit evenly where you can see all these background characters, the foreground characters, but because the composition is strong with a nice framing element, with atmosphere, and with a nice strong light, and the bounce light, you get a focal point, and your eye instantly goes there. So you know exactly where to look. In that split second, you only have 2 seconds to consume everything that's happening in the scene before the camera changes and shows you some new composition. There was a scene from The Incredibles that I worked on that it amazed me in the end when I was given a shot that it's the sequence where Dash and Violet are having an argument in the dining room, and Mrs. Incredible is sitting at the table trying to keep the kids calm, and they get into an argument. And so Dash decides to start running around the table super fast because he's really fast, and Violet has force field abilities. And so she sends up a force field that Dash then runs into, bangs off of the force field, and then they, get into a fist fight under the table. But what was amazing to me when I got the shot is that the way it was cut, there was one shot where you see the force field that Dash is running into, and it was only 3 frames long. Well, if you have a shot that's 24 frames a second, that's 1/8 of a second that it's up on screen. And yet when you watch it, everybody can tell you exactly what happened. Violet made a force field, boom, came up in front of your eyes. And those shots are so short, 3 frames for one of them, 4 or 5 frames for the other. Your brain is amazingly good at reading these images so incredibly fast. In 1/8 of a second, you can see those frames, that angle of the camera, and read what was telling. So all the more important for your lighting to follow kind of split-second composition. You need to be able to have a focus so that you can, tell what's happening in the story. So again, everything with lighting It's all about storytelling. You know, whether you're doing illustration, whether you're doing fine art, or whether you're making, making films, storytelling is everything. You know, it's all about, it's what makes it enjoyable for the viewer to watch. The mood and the emotion that you feel. Lighting should always, and camera should always aid the storytelling of what the director wants to say. It should always be something that, naturally flows with it. Mood and emotion. I can't even, I'm kind of stumbling over my words here because this is just such an important part of filmmaking. If done well, nobody will notice it consciously, but they will feel it emotionally. They will just kind of be drawn in with the mood and the emotion. And the last thing I want to say, talking about composition before we move on to some more practical stuff, is a lot of students focus on making realistic lighting, that they want it to look like reality. And over the years, I've found that that's not really what I'm aiming at. I'm aiming for fantastic believability instead, which is so much better than realism. You get enough of realism. You can 3D model a house and it looks totally realistic, but it's just not interesting. So, add something with character, with style. Make something that's better than reality. Make a world that people desire to go to, that they're just like, oh, I don't get that here. I want to go to that magical place. Something that's fantastically believable. It has all the, concerning lighting, if it has all of the way that light bounces and, moves in a scene, just like it does in our physics of our world, then great. It'll be believable, but make it fantastic. Make it something that's just really interesting and that makes you want to dive into it. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about something else.